Well, for a city girl, it was quite a shock. We had no idea that our only water source we were sitting on top of with septic tanks, and I didn't even know what that was. Every house had a septic tank, and so everything that came out of the house went into the tank and just sat there in your front yard, and it was like, what? And of course the solids would stay in the tank and the liquids would drain down through the sand into the various layers of water beneath us, and we have no other water supply. So it's no surprise that when the population increased, the water supply became undrinkable from the upper aquifer, which was the really good soft water that was touted back in the 50s. And by the 70s, it really was dangerous. They had to drill lower to the lower aquifer. The early 70s was when it became critical that the water testing was showing too many nitrates. People in the county at the Regional Water Quality Control Board, they knew they had to do something, but you couldn't really make that happen without buy-in from the town as well. And I would say the cost was a big feature. This was a low-income place. It was a bedroom community. There wasn't a lot of money. The pipes in the ground are the most expensive part to doing a sewer. And the lots were far apart. Who was going to pay for the pipes in front of all these vacant lots? Certainly it wasn't going to be the county. And the few people that lived there, they didn't want to pay for it either. So it just kept getting worse and worse. The Regional Water Quality Control Board was clamping down on the county to do something. The county made several abortive attempts, including getting Superfund money, but the town also had to vote itself to pay for the sewer, and people were afraid that if there was a sewer, that the prospective perhaps 40,000 people would move there as opposed to the 15,000 some odd that actually lived there. And that would change the character of the town completely. So there was people who didn't believe we had any problem, that there was no pollution. There were people that really didn't want to pay for it. And then there were people who knew that this was a no-win situation. At some point, we had to have a sewer. So there was a great deal of conflict in town. Well, the town didn't like the solutions that the county came up with. They came up with a couple different solutions during the 70s and 80s, but people really didn't like those solutions. 3 times they tried to form a community services district, which would take the ability to build a sewer away from the county and give it to this community services district. So finally in 1998, enough people wanted to do this, and there was something like 87% of the people agreed that we should be in control of our own sewer, what kind we want to build and where we want to put it. So that was when it started. However, the people that were against having a sewer didn't go away. So even though at one point when the CSD was formed, they were going to do ponds and a step-steg collection system, which is a lot different than a traditional big gravity pipes in the ground system, that would also provide some recreational opportunities and be a thing of beauty in the center of town. However, the water board did not agree with the results of the testing of that sort of a plant. And so they went to an international company to build a state-of-the-art plant using MBR technology on a very small footprint, because that's all the property they had in the center of town. They needed acres and acres for the ponds, which they didn't realize, and they couldn't afford it. So they had a state-of-the-art plant built, which was even more terrifying to people in town. When there was a recall election and a thing called Measure B, which forbade a sewer plant near a church, a library, a community center. So Measure B passed by 20 votes. 3 directors that were pro-sewer on the board were ejected with a recall election, anti-sewer or not this sewer. People were elected, and the whole thing went off the rails at that point because the sewer had begun being built with pipes in the street. The new board said, no, we're not going to do that. They failed to notify the state, which had granted the money to fund this. And they didn't notify the state they were going to change course. So the state shut down the money. And the following year, actually about 7 months later, the CSD went bankrupt and had no money for anything. So at that point, some very interesting, different alternative methods. People who were in companies that did these other methods came into town and tried to sell the community on these different methods, which split the community even farther. But every single one of them was not cheaper than what they had planned originally in the year 2000. And there were many lies and distortions of what these things could do, and the whole thing really sort of went off the rails. So a state assemblyman named Sam Blakesley started going behind the scenes to take this sewer project away from the CSD, because CSDs are a child of the state. And so there had to be a legislation written, AB 2701, and the state voted unanimously, and Governor Schwarzenegger signed the legislation, which would take it away from the CSD for now and offer it to the county, but it was really in limbo. The county didn't have to accept it. The county had already spent $6 million abortive dollars on trying to build a sewer, and that was money that was just lost. And so as to whether or not they were going to accept the project depended on whether the people would vote themselves to pay for the sewer, which the costs had risen tremendously over the years. Something that was $39 a month had now become $205 a month. And as to what it was going to cost, nobody really knew, but there was a $25,000 cap on it. So we all got these ballots in the mail, and it only went this time to property owners. So property owners voted in a very strong fashion to vote to assess themselves, because they knew without water, their property was valueless. So people did vote, and the county took about 3 years to figure whether or not they were going to accept the project. But they did a tremendously good job in educating the public. So the sewer got built, and it took several years, about 4 years to build it. But it's up and running, and the water testing is showing that the nitrates are diminishing, and that saltwater intrusion is not advancing. So I think we're saved. Well, I think the biggest lesson to learn is how to build community back together. People, best friends, would split up over the sewer issue. It was the craziest thing. I mean, coming from a big city, I'd never seen anything on this personal level where people were just angry at each other, that the meetings were so contentious. A sheriff had to be in the back of the room. And I was personally accosted by two people yelling at me that I was on the wrong side of this, and it was just ugly. And so I guess the big lesson is, how do we prevent anything this awful from happening in the future? I mean, at some point we could grow and become a city. Do we want to do that? Can we speak to each other in kind terms and not disparage personal opinions? Just leave it that we have a difference of opinion and not that we hate each other. So I think the biggest lesson is, how do we respect each other, have differences of opinion, and accept how voting goes?